He tried to send me to nursing home after selling my home for $1 million. Hear how it happened. Father, he began. The words stretched and softened, a silken rope meant to bind. I had an appointment today, a very important one regarding the future. Our future. He didn't look at the shelves. He never did. They were just wood and paper to him. But to me, they were the preserved echoes of 1,000 minds, the collective wisdom of a species I had hoped my son would one day appreciate. I merely nodded, slowly stirring the tea, my mind, sharp despite the years, already cataloging the discrepancies in his demeanor. Elias was a businessman, a successful, ruthless one, who only ever spoke of the future when a significant amount of money was at stake. And yet he was here, on a Tuesday afternoon, personally serving me tea instead of barking orders into a phone. He took the seat opposite me, his posture too relaxed, too open, like a predator displaying its harmless belly before the strike, and he placed a thick, cream-colored envelope on the coffee table, deliberately angled so the crisp logo of Sterling and Finch Realty was prominent. It was about the house, Father, he continued, leaning forward, his hands clasped neatly between his knees. This beautiful, magnificent old place. It's become a burden, hasn't it? The maintenance, the taxes, the sheer effort required to keep it from crumbling around us. He swept a hand vaguely toward the ceiling, not with appreciation, but with condescending pity. It's simply too much for you. Or for me, frankly. I mean, I have my own life, my penthouse, my career, my real responsibilities. I stopped stirring, the small metallic ring against the porcelain cup the only sound in the cavernous room, and I looked at my son, truly looked at the man he had become, the expensive, tailored suit, the flawless watch, the eyes that only saw value in terms of liquid capital. A burden, you say, Elias? I echoed, my voice surprisingly steady, though a cold, subterranean fear had begun to pool in my stomach. This house, the one your mother loved, the one where you took your first step and learned to read the Iliad, is a burden? Or is it merely an asset that hasn't been liquidated to your satisfaction? The question hung in the air, heavy with accusation and years of unspoken disappointment. He didn't flinch. That was the most terrifying part. He met my gaze with a practiced, regretful sincerity. Please, Father, don't use that tone. This isn't about me. This is about security. Your security. He pushed the envelope closer, a pale, innocuous vessel of devastation. The market is unprecedented. The development in the city center has made this lot, this acreage, worth a staggering amount. I've been working tirelessly for the past 6 months, navigating complex zoning laws and dealing with the city council. I've secured a buyer, a consortium, actually, who are willing to pay a sum that will utterly change your life. No more worries. Pure freedom. I finally picked up the envelope, my fingers, slightly arthritic, feeling the strange finality of the thick paper, and I pulled out the document. A single-page summary with the numbers already highlighted in canary yellow. My eyes fixed on the line item. Final sale price, $1 million. 00, $1 million. It was a dizzying, obscene figure for this crumbling, beloved edifice. And what, precisely, Elias? I asked, my throat tightening, the words now coming out slow, deliberate, each one a stone being pulled from my chest. Is your plan for this freedom? Where does this newfound security allow me to reside? Am I to live in a gilded cage in your penthouse, staring at the concrete canyons you so admire? Elias allowed a small, practiced sigh to escape, as if my lack of vision was the real tragedy here. He reached back into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced a second, smaller, but equally pristine envelope, this one a soft, institutional blue. Of course not, Father. You know I respect your independence. I've found the perfect place, a serene, well-appointed community where you can focus entirely on yourself, where everything is taken care of. He held the blue envelope out, a gesture of ultimate, cold finality, a bureaucratic death sentence wrapped in a ribbon of filial duty. It's called the Whispering Pines Residence. It has a beautiful library, an excellent medical staff, and they even offer daily discussion groups on classic literature. I've paid the first year in full. Everything is handled. All you have to do is sign the final closing papers for the house, which are right here. He tapped the cream envelope. And we can arrange your move by the end of the month. That was the unexpected event that disrupted the status quo. It wasn't the sum of money, though that was staggering. It was the ticket to the Whispering Pines residence. It was the cold, undeniable realization that while I had been sitting there, dreaming of the next book I would read, my son, my only flesh and blood, had been systematically dismantling the very foundation of my existence, negotiating the price of my memories, and preparing my elegant exile. He hadn't asked, he hadn't suggested, he had executed a transaction, treating me not as his father, the man who had sacrificed his own ambitions to ensure Elias had the best education, but as a minor logistical detail in a multi-million-dollar property deal. The blood drained from my face, a sudden, heavy rush, leaving me dizzy and strangely light. You sold the house. I whispered, the words tasting like ash. You sold my home. Without a word. Without a single discussion. I didn't need to ask who had signed the preliminary contracts. Elias had power of attorney, a document I had foolishly, trustingly signed 3 years ago after a minor health scare. A document he had assured me was merely a safeguard for emergencies, a tool for convenience. It was a tool, all right, a finely honed axe he'd buried in the root of my life. He shrugged, a small, dismissive movement that spoke volumes of his moral indifference. I used the power of attorney, yes. It was necessary to secure the full price and ensure a quick close. Any hesitation, any delay from a sentimental conversation would have spooked the buyers. You wouldn't have understood the complexity of the deal, Father. I acted decisively, on your behalf, to ensure your financial security for the rest of your life. He leaned closer, and the false pity in his eyes curdled into a genuine, fleeting irritation that he had to explain himself. Look, $1 million. That's almost $500,000 after all the estate taxes and fees are settled. That's a legacy. The house was just brick and mortar. Now, it's financial peace. You should be thanking me. The climactic moment of Act 1 wasn't a shout or a physical confrontation. It was the chilling, absolute certainty that the person I had loved, nurtured, and believed in had vanished, replaced by an efficient, well-dressed stranger. It was the death of a relationship, the slow, agonizing realization of emotional conflict and personal loss. I slowly stood up, placing the documents back on the table, not tearing them, not throwing them, but laying them down with a reverence for the sheer scale of the betrayal. My hands were shaking, not with fear, but with a silent, profound rage that was deeper and colder than anything I had ever felt. Elias, I said, my voice now low, a rumble, completely devoid of the paternal warmth that had always been my default. When you were 5, you broke a crystal vase that had been in our family for 4 generations. You came to me, weeping, your small face a mask of terror, and I held you, and I told you that objects can be replaced, but trust cannot. You remember that? He shifted uncomfortably, the memory, perhaps, briefly piercing the hard shell of his corporate soul. Father, this is hardly a crystal vase. No. I cut him off, a sharp, surgical precision in my tone. It is not. A vase is an object. This is an act of calculated, premeditated cruelty. You didn't do this for my security. You did this because $1 million is a number you could not ignore. You saw your inheritance, your future inheritance, trapped in a structure that wasn't producing immediate returns, and you used a legal loophole to seize it while I was still alive, condemning me to an institutional bed so you could feel the clean, comforting weight of that money in your own account. I picked up the blue envelope, the ticket to my oblivion, and held it between 2 fingers, as if it were contaminated. You paid a year's rent on my prison, Elias, but you didn't even have the courage to wait until I was gone. You sold your father's home and gave him a one-way ticket to a nursing home. What a legacy you have built for yourself. He stood up then, his face finally losing the veneer of calm, a flush of genuine anger and defensiveness rising on his neck. This is ungrateful. I've given you a life. $1 million. What more do you want? To die alone in this drafty museum? I am taking care of you. I have done everything right. You have done everything legal. I corrected him, stepping back toward the bookshelves, toward the familiar solidity of the world he had tried to erase. But legality, my son, is a poor substitute for morality. I want nothing from you. I want only to tell you that you are not welcome in this house again, or wherever I may end up. The moment you finalize that sale, You severed the tie. You have bought your $1 million, but you have spent your soul, and you have lost your father. I turned my back on him, letting my gaze sweep over the spines of my books, the final moment of emotional conflict and personal loss settling over me like a shroud. I heard the muffled, indignant sound of him gathering the papers, the crisp retreat of his expensive shoes on the hardwood floor, and finally, the heavy, definitive clunk of the front door closing. I did not turn around. I listened to the sound of his car, a powerful engine, accelerating away, rushing toward the freedom his money had purchased, leaving me stranded in a home that was no longer mine. With a month left before the new owners arrived, and the crushing, horrifying realization that the boy I had raised had grown up to be the man who signed the deed to my demise. The sun had set, and I was left in the deep, terrifying shadow of betrayal. The silence that followed Elias's departure was not empty. It was a pressurized vacuum, thick with the unspent energy of rage and the bitter chill of absolute isolation. I stood for a long time in the library, the scent of expensive cologne warring with the honest dust of my life, the blue envelope, my sentence, still resting on the mahogany, a beacon of my foolish trust. I hadn't raised a son. I had nurtured a financier, a calculating machine who valued the square footage more than the history contained within it. And my first, desperate attempt to reclaim my dignity was rooted in the deeply flawed belief that I could still reason with the world that Elias represented. The old man, the scholar, was suddenly forced to become the warrior, albeit a poorly equipped one. My initial action was simple, a pathetic clutching at the fraying edges of control. I called my lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, a man whose integrity I'd relied upon for 30 years, a man who had held my hand when my wife passed, whose voice I expected to be the fortress against the storm. I spent an agonizing hour recounting the betrayal, the power of attorney, the quick, surgical execution of the sale, my voice cracking not from fear, but from the humiliation of being so utterly blindsided by my own child. I expected reassurance, a plan, a legal siege. Instead, Mr. Abernathy's voice, when it finally responded, was a dry, hollow echo of professionalism, stripped of all warmth. "I am sorry, Arthur," he stated, his tone flat, devoid of the familiar avuncular comfort. "I cannot help you. Elias." He was quite thorough. He informed me of his intentions some time ago. He insisted on a complete, independent review of the power of attorney and all pending documents by a specialist in corporate property transfer. "Everything, Arthur, is watertight. The moment you signed that document, you granted him the right to act in your best financial interest, and the sale, on paper, is demonstrably so. $1 million for a house of that age is a phenomenal price. It's a closed case." The line went dead, but the shock reverberated in the room. Trust was lost, not just with Elias, but with my supposed ally, Mr. Abernathy, who had apparently been privy to the conspiracy, perhaps even consulting on the legality of my own undoing. He wasn't a new enemy, but a ghost from the past, an old friend who had silently switched sides, choosing the certainty of Elias's future fees over the defense of an old man's sentimental rights. I realized then that my war was not against a single, greedy son, but against a system, the cold, efficient, legal financial complex that Elias had so masterfully learned to wield. The escalation began in earnest the next day. Driven by a frantic need to understand the specifics of the $1 million transaction, I decided to bypass Elias's corporate wall and go straight to the alleged buyers, Sterling and Finch Realty. They were a consortium, Elias had said, and I felt a flicker of hope that perhaps they were merely ignorant pawns, and that the buyer-seller contract could be dissolved if I could appeal to their moral center, or at least uncover a procedural error. I drove my ancient, reliable sedan, a car Elias had long urged me to trade for something appropriate, to their sleek, glass and steel headquarters downtown. I was met not by the principals, but by a young woman named M.S. Henderson, an associate, impeccably dressed and radiating the chilling indifference of someone whose only job was to manage inconvenient elderly people. I demanded to see the closing documents, to see the signatures, to understand the distribution of funds. "Sir," she said, folding her hands neatly on the polished desk, her smile as sharp and pointless as a freshly minted coin, All matters regarding the purchase of the Blackwood estate are being handled exclusively by the legal representative of the seller, Mr. Elias Thorne. The contract is firm, the earnest money is non-refundable, and the closing date is precisely 3 weeks from today. Furthermore, she paused, pulling up a digital file. Mr. Thorne has already received and deposited the majority of the funds into a private trust established for your financial well-being and has explicitly instructed us to redirect any and all inquiries back to him. But who is the buyer? I insisted, leaning forward, my voice strained. A consortium? Give me a name. I need to know who is profiting from the theft of my home. Ms. Henderson's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened. The primary signatory on the purchase agreement, sir, is a holding company called Phoenix Investments, LLC. We are legally bound by a non-disclosure clause regarding their private membership, which, I can assure you, is standard practice for high-value development deals. As she spoke, she made a dismissive gesture to the security guard who had quietly materialized near the door. The message was clear. My time was up, and my quest for truth had hit a dead end, encased in layers of shell corporations and legal protections. I left the sterile building, the metallic taste of defeat coating my tongue, realizing that Elias wasn't just a betrayal. He was a sophisticated, well-protected new enemy, utilizing the law itself as his weapon. The profound failure came when I returned home that evening, utterly defeated and physically exhausted. I tried to access my own financial accounts. The ones Elias had promised me contained the remainder of the money, the funds meant for my financial peace. I needed to see the deposit. I needed confirmation that at least the money, the $1 million, was real, a tangible piece of my lost home. I sat at my old, mahogany desk, the one where I'd helped Elias with his first business plan, and logged onto the bank's website. I entered my password, and it was rejected. I tried again. Rejected. I called the bank's automated line, only to be informed that the primary account holder has successfully filed a change of control and access protocols. For security reasons, you will need to contact the authorized representative. I knew who the authorized representative was. Elias. I stared at the screen, the glowing letters mocking me. The phrase change of control was a euphemism for complete disenfranchisement. Elias had moved the money, or at least the bulk of the proceeds after his fees and expenses, into a trust, likely making himself the sole trustee with complete control over the disbursements. And then, he had revoked my online access and changed the passwords. I was a man who legally owned the proceeds of $1 million sale, yet I was, in reality, destitute, unable to access a single penny of my own alleged fortune, a ward of a legal structure designed to protect him from my possible interference. This was the moment of harsh failure and loss of hope. It wasn't just the loss of the house. It was the loss of my financial autonomy, my ability to choose, to fight, or even to pay for a taxi. Elias hadn't just sold my home. He had effectively imprisoned me inside a financial cage, making the blue ticket to the Whispering Pines residence not an insulting option, but a grim, unavoidable necessity. I was trapped in my own house, a visitor with 3 weeks left, completely dependent on the goodwill of the man who had engineered my ruin. I slumped back in my chair, the vast library now feeling like a tomb, and my gaze fell upon the only personal photograph Elias kept in his office growing up, a faded image of him, age 7, sitting on my knee, beaming. It was a picture of perfect, uncomplicated love. That boy was gone. In his place was the man who had committed the ultimate, bloodless crime, the theft of a father's future. The fight I had intended to wage with righteous anger and legal maneuvering had been extinguished by a few strokes of Elias's pen, leaving me stranded on the precipice of my own exile, entirely alone, with the bitter taste of utter, complete failure. I had tried to act, and in doing so, I had merely confirmed the depth and efficiency of my son's betrayal. The next move, I knew, had to be entirely outside the realm of law and convention, a desperate attempt born not of hope, but of the fierce, cornered stubbornness of an old man who had nothing left to lose. I was still physically present in the house, surrounded by the towering walls of books, but the reality of my financial and legal imprisonment was suffocating. I spent the next few days in a fog of impotent despair, wandering the echoing rooms, the scent of the impending realtor's walkthroughs already tainting the air. The blue envelope sat on my desk, a permanent, grotesque centerpiece. I tried calling Elias one final time, not to plead, but to unleash the cold, philosophical fury I had been storing. He didn't answer. His voice mailbox was full, a small, petty victory for him, a final barrier of silence. I was truly alone, and the move date was looming. The first crack in my isolation didn't come from a grand gesture, but from the low, persistent, rhythmic sound of a shovel scraping concrete outside, a sound that finally dragged me from the leather-bound fortress of my library. It was early evening, the kind of autumnal dusk that makes the shadows long and melancholic, and I walked to the window overlooking the side drive. Standing there, clearing the dead leaves and accumulated winter debris that Elias had always paid someone else to manage, was Mrs. Albright. Mrs. Albright wasn't just my neighbor. She was a fixture of the street, a woman in her late 60s whose exterior was as deceptively sturdy and weather-beaten as an ancient oak tree. She was known for her fierce privacy, her garden gnomes, and her absolute refusal to engage in anything remotely resembling gossip. I had known her for 40 years, nodding over the hedge, trading pleasantries about the weather, but never once crossing the invisible, polite line of neighborly distance. That was why her presence now, quietly and diligently clearing the mess from my property, was so startling. I went out to the driveway, the cold air hitting me with a much-needed shock. "Eleanor," I said, using her first name for perhaps the first time in 2 decades, my voice raspy from disuse. "What are you doing? You don't have to do this. I can manage the yard." The lie felt ridiculous even as I spoke it. I couldn't manage a thing. She stopped shoveling and leaned on the handle, pushing her thick glasses up her nose, her eyes, usually guarded, now blazing with a kind of practical, focused fury. "Nonsense, Arthur. You look like a man who hasn't eaten a decent meal since the Enlightenment. And this isn't about the yard." She dropped the shovel with a clatter. "It's about Elias. And it's about that damned blue envelope you left sitting on the dash of your car for 3 days before you finally noticed it was still there this morning." My heart gave a sickening lurch. The blue envelope. I must have carried it out when I went to the bank, and in my dazed despair, left it on the seat, a public advertisement of my utter defeat. I hadn't realized she had seen it. "Eleanor, this is not your concern." I tried, falling back on old habits of dignified reserve. "Everything on this street is my concern, Arthur. Especially when one of our own is being sold off for parts," she retorted, her voice low but steel strong. She pulled off her gardening gloves and walked toward me, her gaze uncomfortably direct. "I'm not a lawyer, and I'm certainly not a banker, but I am a mother, and I know a snake when I see one. That boy of yours has been slithering around here for 6 months, and I've been watching." She was the unexpected ally, and she didn't offer sympathy. She offered information and a demand for action. "6 months ago," she began, her tone shifting into that of a meticulous observer, "Elias started bringing people to the house late at night, in the dark. Not for dinner. They were sharp-looking men with clipboards and high-visibility vests. They weren't looking at the architecture. They were taking coarse samples of the soil, measuring the boundaries with lasers, and talking about site elevation and mixed-use zoning." My mind, dulled by betrayal, suddenly sharpened. "He told me he was dealing with the city council about zoning. He was, Arthur, but he wasn't doing it to sell the existing house. He was doing it to sell the land for demolition and new construction. The price he got, that pathetic $1 million? That's the fire sale price for a quick flip on a residential property. But this isn't residential anymore. He got the zoning changed." She looked directly into my eyes, delivering the great, devastating truth. "He didn't sell your house for $1 million, Arthur. He sold the approved, high-density zoning permit attached to your land for a figure that, I guarantee you, is closer to $10 million. And he used your power of attorney to do it, because once the zoning was official, the property became a corporate asset, not just a family home, justifying the creation of that shell company, Phoenix Investments, LLC. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. The scale of the deception wasn't just about the house. It was about the colossal, 9-figure difference between a respectable sale and a criminal act of corporate fraud disguised as filial duty. Elias hadn't just secured my financial well-being. He had performed a massive, illegal land grab, keeping the lion's share, the true value of the transaction, entirely off the books and protected by the legal smoke screen of Phoenix Investments. The $1 million I was allegedly getting was just a paltry, legal shield to distract from the $9 million theft. How do you know this, Eleanor? I asked, the words barely a rasp. Because my nephew, Gary, works for the City Planning Commission. When that zoning application went through so quickly, he flagged it. Your land, Arthur, is the cornerstone of the city's new luxury high-rise district. Elias has been cutting side deals with the developers, the real buyers, who are members of that Phoenix Investments LLC, to push through the approval using your power of attorney. He's liquidating the entire future value of the land, not just the current value of the house. Your house is just collateral damage. She had not only given me the great truth that turned everything upside down, the revelation of the true, stolen fortune and the method of the crime, but she had given me a name, Gary, an unexpected, vital connection inside the labyrinth of city bureaucracy. The game had changed instantly. This was no longer a domestic dispute over a lost home. This was a serious white-collar crime, and I had a witness and an inside source. I have 2 weeks left, I stated, the fog lifting, replaced by a cold, clear, calculating rage that felt familiar and invigorating. Elias has all the money locked up. He controls my accounts. The lawyers won't talk. What good is this truth to an old man who can't even afford bus fare? Mrs. Albright fixed me with a gaze that held not pity, but profound respect. It's good because it gives you leverage. Phoenix Investments, LLC, is a high-profile developer. They do not want a public scandal about fraudulent zoning applications or land theft on this scale. The entire deal collapses if the zoning approval is challenged and the details of the $10 million valuation get out. She pulled a small, worn phone book from her apron pocket, flipping it open. Now, Gary is off the clock, but he can give us the names of those developers. You can't fight Elias with a lawsuit, Arthur. You have to fight him with exposure. You have to threaten to ruin his $9 million deal, and in doing so, ruin the developers he's in bed with. She scribbled a number on a slip of paper. Call this man. Tell him what I told you. He'll meet you. He can get you copies of the original zoning application, the one Elias filed. That's the proof you need. She paused, placing her hand gently on my shoulder, a gesture of profound solidarity. You've lost your home, Arthur, but you haven't lost your mind, and you haven't lost your witness. You may be financially bankrupt, but you have the most powerful weapon a scholar knows, the truth. Now go inside. I'll finish the drive. Tomorrow, we start fighting back. I stood there, holding the piece of paper, the chill of the evening air no longer feeling like despair, but like a sharp, bracing clarity. My son hadn't just betrayed me. He had robbed me of a fortune and committed an enormous crime, and I, the victim, now possessed the key to his destruction. The loss of hope was replaced by a grim, focused determination. I had an ally, a plan, and the coordinates to a battle far larger and far dirtier than I had ever anticipated. The game had become all or nothing. The moment I stood on the asphalt of Mrs. Albright's driveway, holding the slip of paper with Gary's number, the fight ceased being about saving my home and became a desperate, primal need for justice. The revelation that Elias hadn't just sold the house, but had fraudulently sold the land for an estimated $10 million, pocketing the vast majority, transformed my paternal grief into a cold, hard, legalistic fury. I was no longer an aging scholar betrayed. I was the primary victim in a massive case of corporate malfeasance. The first step was the meeting with Gary, Mrs. Albright's nephew, an ally I had never met, but whose cooperation was my only lifeline. Eleanor, my unexpected, formidable ally, had arranged the meeting for the next morning in the anonymous, crowded sanctuary of the City Hall coffee shop, a place where hushed conversations were drowned out by the hiss of the espresso machine and the endless flow of municipal employees. I arrived early, wearing my best, albeit worn, tweed suit, a final attempt to project the authority that had been stripped from me. Gary, a man in his early 30s with the tired, watchful eyes of a bureaucrat who had seen too much corruption, was initially guarded. He spoke in clipped, nervous sentences, looking constantly over his shoulder. My aunt asked me to help, Mr. Thorne, but you have to understand the risk. Phoenix Investments, LLC, the real developers, they have people everywhere. This zoning fast track was a done deal, bought and paid for. If I hand over these files, I lose my career, maybe more. He slid a manila envelope across the table, not pushing it into my hand, but merely placing it where I could reach it. Here are the files. The original residential survey, the application for the zoning variance, and the minutes from the executive committee meeting where the estimated land value for high-rise commercial was assessed. Look at the date. Look at the figures. Elias's signature is on everything, using your power of attorney. He didn't sell your house for $1 million. He sold the land, with the newly approved commercial zoning, for an estimated $9. $8 million. The paper confirmation of Eleanor's truth was devastating. I didn't need to read the full pages. The headings and the astronomical figures were enough. The $1 million was just a paltry, necessary tax deduction and a distraction for the old man. I was holding the evidence that proved my son was not just a greedy child, but a master criminal. The weight of the envelope felt like the burden of the entire world. "Gary," I said, my voice low and urgent, holding his gaze with the intensity one usually reserved for parsing a complex philosophical text. "I appreciate the risk you're taking. But you are not just helping me. You are exposing a crime that corrupts the very infrastructure of this city. What can I do to protect you?" He shook his head, a wry, defeated smile touching his lips. "Nothing, sir. Just use the files. The only thing that can protect me is the total collapse of this deal, so the developers have bigger things to worry about than a low-level analyst." He finished his coffee, stood abruptly, and walked out, leaving me alone with my devastating proof. I was holding the thermonuclear weapon that could destroy Elias and, more importantly, the powerful, shadowy entities behind Phoenix Investments. The confrontation was now inevitable, but it required an intermediary. I knew I couldn't simply send the documents to the police. Elias had structured the $1 million transaction to look legal, and any initial investigation would stall in the corporate labyrinth. I had to go straight to the top of the food chain, to the developers themselves, and use the threat of a massive public scandal to force their hand. I needed to scare them into undoing Elias's crime. With Eleanor's help, I located the name of the primary operating partner of Phoenix Investments, Marcus Thorne. The last name was a coincidence, or so I initially assumed, but the man was a titan in city development, known for his ruthless efficiency and his absolute intolerance for media exposure. I called his office, not through the switchboard, but using a direct, private line Eleanor's resourceful nephew had provided. I identified myself simply as Arthur Thorne, the current, legal owner of the Blackwood estate and the possessor of all zoning files related to the parcel. Marcus Thorne agreed to an immediate, private meeting. His reaction was not curiosity, but a chilling, instant calculation, confirming that he knew exactly how compromised his acquisition was. The meeting took place that evening in a pristine, soulless conference room atop one of Marcus Thorne's completed high-rises, a symbolic gesture of his power, forcing me to gaze out at the city he controlled. He was a man in his 50s, impeccably groomed, with the unsettling composure of a seasoned card player. "Mr. Thorne," he began, without offering a hand, his voice cold and flat. "I assume this is about the transaction concerning your property. My understanding is that the matter was handled by your son, Elias Thorne, using your power of attorney, and a generous sum of $1 million was transferred for your continued care." I pushed the manila envelope across the polished glass table, letting it slide to a stop directly in front of him. "That is the simplified narrative, Mr. Thorne. This," I tapped the envelope, "is the truth. Inside, you will find irrefutable proof that my son, in concert with his buyers, which is to say, your associates in Phoenix Investments, submitted a fraudulent application for a zoning variance, effectively upgrading the land's value from residential to commercial, and that the true value of the parcel, upon which your development plans depend, is closer to $9. $8 million. Furthermore, you will find evidence that my son signed these documents while acting under a limited power of attorney intended for my medical care, not for the purpose of committing massive corporate fraud." Marcus Thorne did not flinch, but his stillness was more terrifying than any outburst. He slowly opened the envelope, scanned the key documents, and then, without looking up, said, This is merely a disgruntled old man attempting to renegotiate a settlement. Your son acted legally. My son acted criminally. I countered, leaning forward, my voice resonating with the finality of a judge's verdict. And if I walk out of this building and send copies of these documents, including the commercial valuation, the dates of the zoning approval, and the name of the junior city employee who can testify to the irregularity, to 3 key news outlets and the city attorney's office, your $9.8 million deal is dead. The zoning variance will be retracted, Phoenix Investments will be investigated for fraud, and the resulting public scandal will tank every project you have currently pending. You will lose far more than this one parcel, Marcus. I have nothing left to lose, which, ironically, makes me more dangerous than anyone you have ever faced. He finally looked up, his eyes 2 chips of ice, and this was the moment of the all-or-nothing choice. He smiled, a thin, cruel gesture. So, Arthur, what is your price for your silence? What is the real purpose of this performance? Do you want 2 million? 3. We can settle this quietly. You can disappear into that nursing home with a larger nest egg, and we all walk away clean. The offer was a profound temptation. It was the only way to escape the humiliation of the nursing home, to regain some measure of financial security, to not have to rely on Eleanor's charity. I could take the money and vanish, saving what little was left of my life. This was the moment where the hero must make a choice in someone's favor. But then, the image of Elias flashed in my mind. His cold, practiced smile as he handed me the blue ticket, his assumption that I would simply fade away. The money was irrelevant. The principle was everything. Accepting his settlement was accepting his view of me, as a man who could be bought, silenced, and forgotten. My inner strength, that stubborn, unforgiving human anger and pity for the old man I used to be, took over. My price is not money, Marcus, I said, my voice shaking slightly, but holding firm. My price is the utter destruction of my son's career and the complete, public repudiation of your purchase. My price is that you immediately void the sale, return the full $9.8 million to the trust before any of Elias's fees are paid, and that you inform Elias that the deal has collapsed and that he is exposed. Marcus Thorne leaned back, his composure finally cracking, replaced by a flicker of disbelief. You would ruin your own son? For a house you can't even maintain? My son ruined himself when he sold the land, stripped me of my dignity, and bought me a cage, I retorted. I am merely holding him accountable. And here is your choice, Marcus. You can face the public investigation and the destruction of your entire corporate empire, or you can quietly void the deal, cut your losses, and simply lose the time you invested. The files go public at dawn tomorrow. The clock is ticking. The silence in the room stretched, thick and suffocating, until finally, he leaned forward and pressed an intercom button. Get Elias Thorne on the line. Now. This was the climax. The moment of confrontation I hadn't even planned. Marcus Thorne, knowing the catastrophic risk of the public exposure, chose the lesser evil, throwing Elias to the wolves. Elias answered, his voice confident, arrogant. Marcus put the phone on speaker, allowing the full horror of the moment to play out. Elias, Marcus stated, his voice now laced with pure, lethal contempt. The deal is off. Your zoning application is compromised. Your father has all the original files, and he is threatening to send them to the press and the city attorney. The Phoenix Investments deal is voided, effective immediately. We are cutting our losses. And by the way, the total funds, the full $9.8 million, are being recalled from your trust and immediately returned to the purchasing entity to dissolve the contract without legal recourse. You have just lost the biggest deal of your life, and you have exposed a multi-million-dollar corporation to federal investigation. I suggest you contact your father immediately, as he is currently in my office, and he is determined to see you destroyed. The ensuing silence from Elias's end was the sound of a universe collapsing. Then, a strangled, panicked sound, a raw, human gasp. I leaned into the speaker. The house is returned to my name, Elias. The power of attorney is voided, effective immediately, and every penny of that $9.8 million is gone from your control. Your greed made you stupid. You didn't just lose the money. You exposed your entire criminal operation for a pathetic $1 million down payment. You have 3 weeks to figure out how to rebuild your life. As for me, I stood up, gathering the manila envelope, now empty. I will be home, in my house, waiting for the deed to be returned. Do not ever contact me again. I walked out of that building, leaving Marcus Thorne staring into the ruin of his deal and Elias's terrified voice trapped on the speakerphone. I hadn't saved my home with virtue or kindness. I had saved it with a cold, unforgiving act of self-preservation and the devastating fury of a betrayed father who refused to be bought. I had stared into the face of my son's destruction, and I had chosen justice over love. The inner strength I found was not heroic. It was the sheer, brutal stubbornness to survive, and the anger to punish the architect of my near demise. I was victorious, but the victory tasted like ash. I had won my house back, but I had permanently lost my son. The victory I had snatched from the high-rise conference room was a hollow, brittle thing. I returned to the house, not with triumph, but with a bone-deep exhaustion that seemed to weigh down every joint, every memory. Within 48 hours, the legal machinery, now moving in reverse with desperate speed orchestrated by Marcus Thorne to save his own skin, had executed the full reversal. A nervous, low-level attorney from Sterling and Finch Realty personally delivered the voided deed, confirming the property was back in my sole name. The power of attorney was officially rescinded, and the entire $9.8 million transaction had been dissolved, leaving Elias with nothing but the smoldering wreckage of his ambition and the profound scorn of the corporate world he had tried to conquer. The house was mine again, the threat of the Whispering Pines residence erased, but the betrayal was not. It lived in the air, in the silent accusation of the empty chair opposite mine, and in the refusal of the phone to ring. My physical home was saved, but the home of my heart, the connection to my son, was irreparably destroyed. Eleanor Albright, my fierce and loyal ally, came over that evening. We sat in the kitchen, not the grand library, but the warm, familiar space where my wife and I had shared countless meals. She brought a casserole, a silent, comforting counterpoint to the legal warfare we had waged. "So, Arthur," she said, her voice softer now that the danger had passed, "you won. The house is safe. The thief is disarmed. What now?" "Now." I stared into my untouched tea. "Now I live here, Eleanor. Alone. I have peace, but I have no legacy. I have land, but I have lost my seed. I traded my son for a house. I finally confessed the truth that had been haunting me since I spoke those final, unforgiving words into Marcus Thorne's speakerphone. I could have taken the financial settlement. I could have retired wealthy, allowing Elias to live with his guilt and his money. But I chose to ruin him. I chose justice over mercy, and in doing so, I made myself his executioner. I didn't save myself, I punished him. And now I have to live with the silence." Eleanor listened, nodding slowly, her gaze fixed on the steaming casserole. "You think you had a choice between justice and mercy?" "I disagree, Arthur." Elias forced your hand. "He didn't just steal money. He tried to steal your identity, your dignity, and your very right to self-determination. He set himself up as a jailer, and you fought your way out. He lost his wealth, but he still has his life. You could have lost everything." "But I was his father," I insisted, the word a weary ache in my chest. "A father is supposed to lift up, not strike down. I had the power to forgive, and I chose the power to destroy." The silence returned, heavier this time. I felt the profound philosophical subtext of my resolution, the crushing weight of responsibility that comes with absolute power, even the power of a desperate, betrayed old man. I was an intellectual, a student of moral philosophy, yet when faced with the ultimate dilemma, I had chosen the Old Testament fury of retribution. A week later, the expected occurred. Elias sent a letter, not an email, not a call, but a formal, typed, 2-paragraph letter delivered by courier, avoiding any possibility of a face-to-face confrontation. It was not an apology. It was a cold, bitter, final statement, confirming the deep, unbridgeable chasm I had created. "Father, I acknowledge the reversal of the Blackwood estate transaction. You have succeeded in destroying a multi-million-dollar deal and, in doing so, have effectively crippled my standing in the city's financial sector. You proved your point, that your sentimentality is more valuable than my future. I accept the loss. I also accept that our relationship is now irrevocably concluded. I will not attempt to contact you again. I will rebuild my life far away from your influence and your judgment. I wish you well in your solitude. Elias. I read the letter and, without a word, walked it out to the stone incinerator in the backyard, watching the crisp, white paper curl, blacken, and turn to ash, the final, tangible link to my son dissolving into smoke. He still saw me as the sentimental fool, the impediment to his ambition. He felt no remorse, only anger at his failure and my effective counterstrike. The story's resolution was cemented. I had my house, but I was stripped of my line. The $1 million, the 10 million, they had never been the true currency of the conflict. The currency was the relationship, and I had spent it all on a single act of defensive fury. The house remained. I settled back into the routine, the library, the quiet scholarship. Eleanor remained a quiet, comforting presence next door, but the void left by Elias was vast and echoing. One late afternoon, I found a small, unmarked box tucked away in the back of a closet in Elias's old bedroom. It wasn't money or legal documents. It was a collection of his old childhood drawings, reports cards, and a leather-bound journal. I sat on the dusty floor and began to flip through it. The journal wasn't a diary of his corporate scheming. It was from when he was 18, just before he left for university. It spoke of his aspirations, his awe of me, his longing to please me. He wrote about the pressure he felt to live up to my intellectual expectations and the deep, insecure fear that he would never be smart or wise enough, so he decided he would be successful instead, a measure he thought I would finally respect. Then I found the entry from 3 years ago, just after I gave him the power of attorney. He wrote about my minor heart scare, and a line jumped out at me. He looked so frail. I realize now that this house, this weight of history and upkeep, is going to kill him. I have to secure his future. I have to find a way to monetize this place so he can be free and taken care of, whether he wants it or not. I will be the pragmatic son. I will be the provider, the only role he seems to recognize outside of a book. The discovery of the journal was the moral dilemma that will leave the listener thinking. Was Elias's initial intent entirely malicious? Was the $1 million plan born from a cold calculation of greed, or was it a massively misguided, horribly executed, ultimately corrupt act rooted in a warped sense of filial duty and a desperate need to impress his father with a form of success he understood? Money, because he felt he could never live up to the form I valued. Wisdom? Did the scale of the fraud, the $9.8 million, develop later, once the corporate sharks smelled the blood in the water, turning his initial pragmatism into an unforgivable crime? I never called him. I never sent the journal. I was left with the horrible, crushing realization that perhaps my ultimate victory, my destruction of his life, was based on a fundamental misreading of his deepest motivation. I had seen only the corporate predator, but perhaps I had failed to see the terrified little boy desperate to prove his love through the language of power and finance, a language I had always dismissed. The final image of the story is me, Arthur Thorne, back in my library. The house is silent, mine to the last nail. I am holding the brittle, 18-year-old journal in one hand and a copy of Elias's cold, dismissive final letter in the other. The philosophical subtext is clear. In the pursuit of justice, we often fail to recognize that the greatest crimes are not just about greed, but about love corrupted by fear, and the deepest betrayals are mutual.